Hi, my name is Grant Hamby, and today I would like to talk about Beethoven's Third Symphony, Opus 55, in E flat major, the Eroica. Um, I wanted to talk about this symphony for a long time because it had a huge impact on me as a kid. In fact, it was really my gateway piece to classical music. When I was in middle school and I just started band, I found a copy or I found an album at the local thrift store, and the cover of it just really intrigued me. I still have it. It was George Zale and the Cleveland Orchestra, and the cover art on it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, you can see that it's really something special. The Napoleon at Calvary at first charge. And as a kid, I was a little bit of a history buff, so naturally the cover, combined with the fact I was getting into music, appealed to me. But when I heard this piece, when I put it on the record player and heard it for the first time, it really just overwhelmed me. And it's such a powerful piece of music. I didn't realize that music like that was actually possible. I grew up in a fairly non-musical home. My parents didn't listen to a wide range of music. They were fairly constricted in their musical taste, and so I hadn't really been exposed to a lot of different sorts of music. When I was exposed to this, it was just like, wow, this is really the bee's knees. So, what was so special about that symphony, and why did I find it so overwhelming? That's a really good question. Why do so many people find Beethoven overwhelming? I mean, I can't remember who said it, but somebody. Gosh, I wish I could remember who said this, but someone once said that Beethoven basically just kind of grabs you up by the shirt and just drags you along with him, whereas other composers can kind of just entice you or tease you into listening to them or being interested in what they have to say. Beethoven just really comes right out and grabs your attention. And I think that's true, and that's true in this symphony in particular. So, kind of guide us along, the first thing I'd like to talk about is the genesis of the symphony a little bit, and then I'd like to talk about its historical context, and then talk a little bit about the piece itself. So, Beethoven told a friend of his, Wenzel Krumpholz was his name, that in 1802 he said that he really wasn't happy, he wasn't satisfied with the musical compositions he had written up to that point. He said, from the day, I mean to take a new path. Well, that new path would lead directly to the Third Symphony, and it would be an extraordinarily new path, as we'll see. The Third Symphony, he began in it in 1802. He started work on it at a little town called Heiligenstadt, and he began his first sketches. Now, 1802 in Heiligenstadt is actually a very significant date and place, because that was also where Beethoven went and where Beethoven wrote what's called the Heiligenstadt Testament, which was his very, very dramatic defense of basically his very own existence. I mean, the Heiligenstadt Testament reads like a suicide note. I mean, Beethoven was getting seriously emo here, and he was doubting his entire reason for living. Now, part of that was because he was going deaf. As a lot of people know, and as I'm sure many of you know, Beethoven was going deaf. He had begun to realize he was going deaf around 1796 or so. But by 1802, the deafness was really starting to encroach on him. And I think he was beginning to realize that there's not going to be a cure, that ultimately he would go deaf. And for a practicing musician, and Beethoven was a practicing musician. He was one of the great virtuosi of his time on piano. That was really, it's a death knell to your career. I mean, it must have just been terribly upsetting to him, and that the faculty that he had most strongly cultivated over the years of his life was now being deprived. He was being deprived of that. So, in 1802, he wrote the Heiligenstadt Testament, in which he more or less charts his own depths of depression and despair, and his near close desire for self-extinction. But he turns back, and in the Testament he says what turned him back was his art. He said, I think it was the art stayed my hand. So At that same time period, we have the first sketches for the Third Symphony. Those sketches did not come to much. However, when he returned to Vienna in 1803, he continued working, on the symphony, the new symphony, and then he spent some time at another little town not far from Heiligenstadt next summer, and he wrote most of the symphony at that point. Now, it's an interesting symphony in that the first three movements are all original material, but a lot of the fourth movement's recycled material from an earlier work called The Creatures of Prometheus that he had gotten a lot of traction. Out of, and quite frankly, he just really enjoyed himself. So evidently, he enjoyed these tunes a lot because he used them also in what's called the Eroica variations for piano. So in 1804, the symphony was premiered, and he was. The premieres were, well, I think a lot of people just didn't understand what he was doing. Really about the only person who seemed to have really understood what Beethoven was up to was Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia. He went through 3 hearings at one of the houses of Beethoven's patrons, Prince Lobkowitz. Prince Lobkowitz had a private orchestra, and he had them to perform the Third Symphony for Prince Louis Ferdinand, who was also an excellent musician. And he loved it so much he wanted to hear it again. Well, the orchestra played it again. Well, he wanted to hear it a third time. And then the Prince Lobkowitz said, hey, let's give him a break, let him go have some dinner, and then we can all assemble and listen to it again, and which they did. So that orchestra played through 3 times, which is extraordinary because, as I said, this is an extraordinary work by any stretch of the imagination. So at the first public performance, the work was not well received at all. People just didn't understand it. One person called out from the audience that if the thing would just stop, they would pay another Kreutzer, basically, which is the price of admission. So in other words, they would pay their ticket again if they could just get it to stop. Also, the reviews were not very favorable, even among Beethoven's admirers at the time. The reviews basically were saying, well, we don't know what to make of this. This is a very strange piece of music, and we don't know what to do with it. So that's the immediate context. The historical context, of course, this work is also famous because it was apparently all dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte. And when Beethoven learned that Napoleon was going to be crowned Emperor of France, or was crowned Emperor of France, he so violently tore the manuscript, the dedication on the manuscript, that he actually tore a hole through the paper. Beethoven was capable of very violent mood shifts and emotional uproars, and this was one of them. And so that's also, created a lot of intrigue as to what did Beethoven really think of Napoleon. Was the work really to be dedicated to Napoleon at all? There's actually some question about that, in terms of its title, Eroica, which means heroic. Was the hero of the Eroica Napoleon? I think some music scholars today think probably so. Others think probably not so. Others actually think Prince Louis Ferdinand is the hero, and there are reasons for that. Louis Ferdinand, a few years later, was killed in action against the French, and many people believe that the hero in Beethoven's estimation was actually him. Louis Ferdinand, like I said, was an outstanding musician and composer too. His works were very far-sighted. Really, I think you would categorize his works as avant-garde for the early 19th century in some respects, in that they look forward to the Romantic era, and certainly later composers such as Schumann and Liszt also. And he was very warm towards Beethoven, and Beethoven reciprocated that. Louis Ferdinand basically treated Beethoven, even though he was the nephew of Frederick the Great, he treated Beethoven really as an equal. and that was something that Beethoven reciprocated. They had a rather close bond in the short time that they knew one another. So some people believe that the hero, so some music scholars have thought that the hero of the Eroica is actually Prince Louis Ferdinand and not Napoleon. Although, even later, Beethoven basically said the symphony is about Napoleon. He said it is a symphony on Bonaparte, and that must have been what he was thinking as he was writing. Beethoven had a very... He had this... I don't want to psychologize him too much, but he had a real problem with tyrants in general, and most of us do. But Beethoven's own father was I think you would class him abusive and a tyrant and a drunkard, and who treated Beethoven and his children and his other children and his wife very badly. He beat Beethoven mercilessly. He would come home late at night drunk, expect Beethoven to perform, and when Beethoven sleepily couldn't perform exactly as he wanted, he would cane him. And Beethoven developed a rather strong hatred for his father, but not just for his father, but what his father represented. This idea of authority, and especially this concept of tyrannical authority. He really just did not approve of that. So, and anytime he sensed that anyone was trying to sort of play that on him, his reactions were often violent. I think you see that with his reaction to Napoleon. Napoleon was a complex figure, actually, like Beethoven. There's a lot of similarities between the two of them in some ways. But when Napoleon basically made this move, it did trigger Beethoven's reaction. So although he could admit that the symphony was about Bonaparte, as he says, but it's the Bonaparte of the first consul, the Bonaparte who was, in some respects, the vanguard of a new way of leading Europe, of a new way of thinking about European history and culture, of modernizing Europe from the old feudal systems that had been in place for nearly 1,000 years. And when Napoleon seemed to slide back into that frame of thinking, I think that was what triggered Beethoven. In addition to his whole concept of the tyrant, of the overbearing father. So, yeah, I mean, you can take that or leave it, but it does seem to be true. Beethoven had a real issue with authority in general, and he did not like to take orders from anyone at all, ever. And he could react very violently if he felt like his freedom was being encroached upon. He could react quite violently. So, yeah, it's a complex thing with Beethoven and Napoleon, because my view is that the symphony was written with Bonaparte in mind. The massive changes that were going on in Europe, I don't think you can pinpoint anything in particular culturally, but I think that's what was really going on. And in light of subsequent events, Beethoven also thought it appropriate, perhaps fitting, that it should be some kind of something in memory of his fallen friend as well. I think a work like the Eroica is such a large, complex work. It's so emotionally diverse. There are passages of genuine sorrow, sadness, passages of great violence, but also passages of great joy as well. I mean, it is an emotional roller coaster as a musical composition, and so it would be unfortunate to pigeonhole it, I think, to having one dimension or another. I mean, I think it would be unfair to say that it was, this is Bonaparte here, or this is even Prince, Louis Ferdinand of Prussia. This is, I think it's like Beethoven. It's a highly complex piece of music. actually, in some respects, doesn't. One of the early criticisms, some of the early criticisms of it was that it did not cohere very well. That these wild modulations and these wild changes of tempo and or rhythmic changes, which are there. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, it it's the kind of music that must have just been so strange because it does not seem to have, if you look at the piece as a whole, the kind of emotional coherence that you would expect to find in, say, Haydn or Mozart. It's just not there. Okay, so let's talk about the music a little bit. The music is groundbreaking. The Eroica absolutely revolutionized the symphony and revolutionized music for the next 100 years. It is a common trope that composers were, daunted by the shadow of Beethoven symphonically, and generally, though, that's usually taken to mean either the Fifth Symphony, for example, or the Ninth Symphony. The Ninth Symphony especially, because the Ninth Symphony is so monumental. But it's really the Third Symphony. And interestingly enough, Beethoven was asked later in life, which was his favorite symphony. I don't think he'd written the Ninth by this point, but basically said it's the Eroica. Because the Eroica is the groundbreaking work. It is absolutely sine qua non the most avant-garde work of the early 19th century, period. And what are the characteristics? Well, for one thing, just expanded time. The first movement alone is as long as a typical Haydn symphony or a typical Mozart symphony. And the work is easily twice as long as the longest classical symphony of the era. It's just incredibly long. It's a huge piece. It's a huge work. The individual movements are incredibly long. And as I mentioned earlier, at the public premiere, that caused some people some consternation. They just didn't know what to do with it. The other thing is the slightly expanded orchestration. He adds another horn to the horn section, which actually does have an effect. It has an aural effect, especially in the third movement, where there is this sort of hunting scene among the horns, and it's a beautiful passage. It's absolutely fantastic. But he wouldn't have been able to do that with just two horns. It took three horns to do that, and also in these fairly loud, somewhat brassy sections, which again you just don't really find in Haydn or Mozart. So that the orchestration seemed to be expanded. A greater role was put in for brass instruments, and that was unusual. So performance time is expanded, orchestration is somewhat expanded, but there are also other, harmonic and structural changes. For one thing, he expands the use of diminished seventh chords. Diminished seventh chords are used, and they're used fairly regularly for modulation. He seems to extend those a great deal. Usually, they're just simply used for transitions whenever you're going to a new key, for example. Maybe used quite a bit in the development section whenever you're having this tonal instability. But Beethoven puts one right at the end of the very first phrase at the beginning of the symphony. Bam! It's right there. It's C sharp in the cellos after they've stated the main theme of the movement. Wow, that was unusual. And then there was also expanded use of modulations. He takes modulatory technique to a new level in the symphony that other symphonists just really didn't, or seldom did, or not to the same extent. And also very daring modulations, direct modulations, for example, and the use of, again, like I've mentioned, the diminished seventh. And then the other thing is extensive use of counterpoint. He uses counterpoint all throughout this symphony. In the development section of the first movement, it is basically a contrapuntal structure. And he has, in the second movement, he has a contrapuntal section, basically a short fugue. He's constantly, and actually there's and I'll, at the end of this video, I'll have a link to take you to what is a fantastic exploration of his use of counterpoint in the final movement. I think you'll find that very interesting. It's more technical, and the music Sean mind, it's more just a discussion of this piece. But do watch that. I highly encourage you. It's by Richard Atkinson. Yeah, go out and watch that. That is absolutely fantastic, and you'd be marveled. I remember when I was a music student years ago, I was talking with my instructor at the time, and I had just finished reading over the second movement of the Third Symphony, and I don't know, I was still kind of young and dumb. Well, I'm not just old and dumb, but back then I was kind of young and dumb. And I said, I said, wow, I said, that fugue in the third movement, the second movement of Beethoven's Third Symphony. And he was like, well, Beethoven really wasn't that good a contrapuntalist. I mean, he really didn't know counterpoint that well. And I felt somewhat shamed at that point, and dumb and ignorant. But really, on reflection, I mean, I think it's true. Beethoven lacked the finesse. He lacked the subtlety of Mozart, for example, or Bach. He's more forceful. He's more direct. But his use of counterpoint is actually quite striking in its form and in its content. And I think that's because when he's combining these sort of wild modulations along with counterpoint, it's a very fascinating thing. So the other thing about the symphony that's quite radical for the time is the rhythmic syncopation. I mean, man, this piece is syncopated, and you get that at the very beginning too. It's like I said, at the end of the first phrase in the first movement, the cello's going to that C sharp. Immediately the first violin starts with this syncopated feature. That's going to become a feature of the whole movement, and a feature of the third movement, and a feature of virtually every single movement. The strong syncopation, the strong accenting of weak beats. That's another thing that Beethoven does, and he does it well, and it really throws you off. I couldn't imagine being a performer, either a performer or listener for these first compositions, for this composition, these first performances, because they must have been bewildered. I do understand. I think I've read somewhere that the performers for Beethoven's Third Symphony they almost really couldn't play it. They just didn't know what to do with it at all. So, and then lastly, there's the sheer violence of the music. It is a violent composition. It's a violent piece of music. It has a great deal of anger, a great deal of urgency, a great deal of forcefulness. I mean, Beethoven literally does just kind of grab you by the shirt collar and drag you along with him. And that's from the very beginning of the symphony. Those first, it starts out with no slow movement, no classical slow movement like he had in his first and second symphonies. Basically, just two very strong, stark chords. Bam, bam. Let's get started. And then throughout the piece, this use of accented weak beats. Not just accented weak beats, but accented weak beats just forcefully put in there, So go out and listen to it. I think you'll hear what I'm saying here, and check out Richard Atkinson's video as well. I'll probably do something a little bit more on this symphony again. I would like to do a video talking about the genesis of Beethoven's work and looking at his sketches and then the final melodies that he came up with, because I think it says a lot about how composers actually perform their composition, actually think about writing and revision. Rare is the composer who can just come up with a really good melody off the top of their head and just write it down and, oops, there it is. And Mozart's one of the few examples that we have of that. That was certainly not the case with Beethoven. He had to sweat it out from beginning to end, and I would like to do another video on that. And probably do it on the second movement. I think that's a good movement to look at. So, well, thanks for watching. I appreciate your time, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you.